I'm going to do the official recording. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our class on battles of the branches. So we're going to look at constitutional battles between the branches, and we're really going to dive into the concept of separation of powers. Now, I'm going to be with you today and help you walk through this class. I'm your moderator. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And I'm here today with Nicholas Mosvick. I'm going to give you your whole official name. And Nick is going to help us understand the Constitution, the history behind the separation of powers, where the ideas came from, and the modern battles that you can see in the news every day. So Nick, do you want to say hi and do an introduction?
Yes, so I'm Nicholas Mosvick, and I am one of our senior fellows in constitutional content at the National Constitution Center. And as I always say, I have both a JD and a PhD in American history, so I am a constitutional history expert.
So that means the JD is a law degree and the PhD is the top degree you can get in the Constitution. So he's got the top of both worlds.
Unfortunately, I can't stay in school anymore.
But that means we can ask him any question we want and we can see if he can get the answer for us. So think about your questions on the Constitution. So today's class has four big parts that we're going to go over. Number one, we're going to start with some clear definitions, which is always my favorite. I'm a definitions kind of person, and I want to hear, what does it actually mean? Give me the definition. And then we're going to dive into the founding story that really starts before the founding of America, and then Andrew Jackson and the bank veto, and then we'll end with some modern battles of the branches. In the chat, I will give you the link to the website that has these classes, videos, PowerPoints, worksheet, everything you want on this class. But let's start with some of these big questions. So how did the Constitution, and why did the Constitution set it up this way? Why do we have battles between the branches? Is this on purpose, or is this like a fluke mistake? So Nick's going to help us understand why we have battles, and then that's going to dive us into these big concepts of separation of powers and checks and balances. And my question will always start with, okay, what does separation of powers even mean? And what is checks and balances? And are they connected? Because I always hear them together. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. Do you want to start with the battles? Do you want to start with separation of powers? Where would you like to go?
Well, we usually start with the Constitution's text, and I think what's worth saying here is, we talked about before we got started, is that unlike a lot of our other classes, there isn't one obvious text one can start with other than what we call the vesting clauses. And when we get to those, we'll talk a little more about them. But this is the idea of the three branches we talk about, right? The legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. Each one of them has what's called a vesting clause, meaning that that particular power is vested in that branch of the government, right? So this creates separate branches, right? So have that part of separation of powers, right? And so we can start with those in terms of seeing where they are in the text. But the greater truth, of course, is that it's all over the Constitution. It's like when we talk about federalism, right? Separation of powers is structurally part of the structural design of the document itself. And that goes to that first question, right? Is this intended to have these battles? And the answer, James Madison tells us, and we'll get to this when we talk more about the founding story. But the idea is that competition between the branches, that's the checks and balances. We separate the powers, but we also want them to compete for power. The reason we want that to happen is we don't want any one branch to dominate, right? We need a balanced government. The only way to achieve that in Madison and the framers' minds was to have this competition of the branches, because otherwise they assumed the legislative branch would most likely dominate, but it was also possible that the executive branch would come to dominate. And either one of those would lead to what they considered tyranny, right, or despotism, rule by the will of another, right? That's what they didn't want to avoid. They thought the way to do this was to build into the structure of the system this type of competition and this sharing of power, but also separation of power, right? So they're related, but we have to also take them one by one, which is why we not only do the definitions, but the founding story, right? So let's start with that basic definition, right? We're talking about the division of power, as I said, between the three branches of government. and the principle that no branch should improperly take power from another branch. And we just talked about the basic structure, right? The 3 branches. We're going to get to modern issues when we get to the end of the class. But separation of powers is designed to ensure each branch will check and balance the others. But it is also not meant to be absolute. As we'll talk about more, part of checks and balances is the idea that these branches share powers too, right? We'll get to examples like the president's veto power, right? Which gives him or her a role in the legislative process, or the Senate's check on the president's power in the form of the Senate's role in treaty making and appointments, right? So those are just a couple of examples. Kerry showed you a couple of those right there, right? But and impeachment is another obvious one too, right? Where the House and the Senate get a role in checking the president, right? So you see that those checks and balances are part of the system. Because separation of powers is not absolute, this related concept of checks and balances is necessary to make a functional constitutional system that does not allow for one of these branches to dominate too much over the others.
Okay, so I think I got it. I'm just gonna like wrap it up so everybody has it. So I love this diagram because if I understand separation of powers correctly, it says that each branch has its own job. However, these should all be almost touching in some ways too, because to get their job done completely, they have to work together in other ways. But what I love what you said, Nick, that made everything kind of click was it's also a competition. There's a little bit of tug and push and pull between the branches, and that's what these lines are for. So sometimes I think about it like a 3-way teeter-totter or a 3-way tug of war. So how do you work together? So if these two work together, they can pull on this one a little bit more. But the idea is that you spread out power with systems that make them still connected. So they have to either work together to get it done or work together to make sure something doesn't get done. And the reason for this is their worry and fear about one branch becoming like a dictator, like too powerful or too controlling, and the other 2 branches don't have enough power. So that's the reasoning behind this. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah, exactly, right? And as I said, they assumed initially it probably would be the legislator, but they didn't assume that would always be true. And of course, today we think about usually the president as being the most powerful member of the government. But the point is that ebbs and flows and separation of powers, checks and balances about the whole system and not just hemming in one branch, right? And that's really important to understand. Is whatever you assume which the branch that is going to dominate, you're still worried about the potential for other branches to have too much power.
So it's like a brilliant system of spreading out power with making everybody work together. This is like a parent's dream. You all have your own jobs, but then you all have to work together. But then there's like a paranoia to it too. Yeah. Like they're really worried. That,
well, it's like two C's and a J, right? The 2 C's are cooperation and competition, and the J is jealousy. We assume some jealousy. We assume that the branches have some envy of the powers in the other parts of the government. And therefore they want a little bit of that, and they're going to compete with each other. When we talk about James Madison in Federalist 51, that's why his language is so notable and memorable, because he says we can't assume that men are angels, because if they were, we wouldn't need government. But they're not, so we make certain assumptions about human nature, and one of those is that even powerful people are going to be jealous of power they do not have. So we need to harness that jealousy for positive good, was the point of the framers, right? Is look, that's human nature, is that there's this drive for power and jealousy and evil things sometimes. But we need to control that, and if we can funnel that actually into good for the larger system, for the people on whole, then we've done our jobs, right? Because we can't cure that problem through government, but we can funnel it into something productive, right? Because if the judiciary is jealous of the other branches to some extent, but also checks too much presidential or congressional power, then the system is working, right? That's the view.
Awesome. And then Jesse just added, so it's like a competition that helps each other out. Therefore, making a government work. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. If it's working right, then the competition becomes a healthy, good for we the people competition. Nice job, Jesse. I like that. Okay, now I love how brilliant this is. I mean, it's a great system, and there's lots of theories. This isn't just, the founding fathers didn't come to Philadelphia in 1787 and all of a sudden like a light bulb went off and they're like, here, I got this idea out of nowhere. They were well read. They read a lot of other people's ideas. And I think this is something that we don't talk about with each other a lot, or students a lot, that you don't always have to come up with your own idea. You're looking at what other people's ideas are and you're putting them together in new ways. So I'm going to jump to kind of some fun names that let's talk about Montesquieu and Locke, who are two of my favorites.
Yeah.
Can't tell if I froze or Nick froze.
Baron von Montesquieu, really both French and British. Oh, am I here?
Yep, you're here. Good.
Okay. So yes, Kerry mentioned Montesquieu and Locke, right? And what we're really talking about, as usual, is we're talking about the influence of the Enlightenment period in the political theory of the Enlightenment on the founding fathers, right, the framers. And Montesquieu writes in the mid-18th century. So he publishes in 1749, and he writes on government generally, and but he theorizes an idea of separation of powers that's strict, right? In other words, Montesquieu thinks that all three branches should be completely distinct from each other and completely separate, right? There really shouldn't be much sharing because that will lead to further problems, right? So Montesquieu is more worried about that. Montesquieu, importantly, has also learned from English history, which is what the framers did as well. And when we talk about that, we're really talking about the 17th century. If you look at 17th century England, a lot happened, right? There was an English Civil War in the 1640s. It was particularly brutal. The king was beheaded, amongst other things. Witch hunts, beheadings, a lot of things, right? Followed by a period of parliament in control, and then the king's restoration in 1660, and then the Glorious Revolution in 1688 that established the principle we call parliamentary supremacy, that the parliament, not the king, is the absolute sovereign of the kingdom. That all.
And what is a parliament? Just so the kids know, what is parliament?
In Parliament is essentially the legislative branch of the British government, the British system of government.
It's like their Congress, just so we all have
There's a House of Commons and a House of Lords, so you can think that is similar to our House and our Senate, right? So it's a two-house system, a legislator, right? And so they take control in 1688 with the fall of James II. All that history, the point that is, they all looked at this history. Locke does this as well, to say what lessons can we take from this? Because during these conflicts, separation of powers was becoming a concept, right? Because they were thinking about both the problem of the king having too much power, claiming too much power, and then Parliament claiming too much power, right? They were witnessing all these problems, right? Because there were critics on both sides of the aisle, essentially, right? Ones who favored more parliamentary power, ones who favored more kingly power. And Montesquieu, writing all this time later, has the benefit of all that history, right? He looks at that and he concludes, Parliament first sketched out a theory of separation of powers in the 1640s during the Civil War, but things went poorly. And Montesquieu, he learned from Locke as well, right? So Locke writes much earlier. He writes around 1680, during the reign of James II and just before the Glorious Revolution. He thought the three branches were not the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative. He thought there was a federative power, not a judicial power, which was related to the executive power, but had to do with things like foreign relations. Montesquieu took Locke's definition and made the judiciary the third branch. And Montesquieu believed that in a republic, civic virtue was important, right? He had a preference for what we call mixed government, which we can get into. And as noted, right, he thought strongly that the three branches should be strictly separated, right? So Locke had talked about it in the 17th century. Parliament had talked about it. It was an issue that was arising through violent experience, frankly. And Montesquieu took all that and distilled it into a theory that all the founders were familiar with. And when we get to Madison, Madison took those lessons, but he changed them a little bit. He learned from them, but he didn't do things quite the same way that Locke and Montesquieu did, right? Which is sort of this more strict separation.
And this is what I love, you know, when you, if you can, and this is literally the definition of creativity. The idea of somebody who's creative and innovative is somebody that takes an idea and makes it better. So when you think about Madison, does like creativity ever pop into your head? Probably not, but he was a super inventive, creative person. So we fast forward, we understand that the founders coming to the Constitutional Convention are reading Locke, they're reading Montesquieu, they're great avid readers of history, of things like Gulliver's Travels. We have a little tiny exhibit at the National Constitution Center, and it's like a little walk-in library, and I love it because you can see all the books that they were reading when they were coming to the convention and that they had on hand at the convention. So the reason why we always make you guys read every week is because we want you to take ideas from all different parts of history, American history, world history, ideas from others, and build it into something new. So fast forward, 1787, you're in Philadelphia, it's a beautiful summer, Constitutional Convention, and they're really talking about building these branches and how they're going to work out. So who are some of the players in this convention that are talking about separation of powers?
Yeah, so I mean, Madison is the most obvious one. There's a reason Friday we're going to have a visit from James Madison, because he's the one who comes to the Constitutional Convention with a plan put together. He's thought about this for months. Jefferson famously sent him a whole library, a ship full of books, to read everything, ancient history, English history, to be prepared for this. So he had thought about the lessons of history and how essentially they could make a better government, right? So Madison had thought a great deal about that. Kerry's shown you Elbridge Gerry and Gouverneur Morris. They're two of our forgotten founders. They're worth reading about. And so certainly they're examples of people who were thinking about these larger issues, right? How power should be separated. This was a really significant part of the conversation that comes up a lot with talking about the presidency, but also Congress, and how strict the separation of powers is going to be. And one thing to step back for a second is to note that the state constitutions, we always talk about this, state constitutions are our first written constitutions in 1776 and shortly thereafter in a couple other states. Those state constitutions, as Kerry's showing you, a lot of them put in strict separation of powers into the text. They put it into their Declaration of Rights or into the main text. So Vermont here is the text states, right? The legislative, executive, and judiciary departments shall be separate and distinct, so that neither exercises the powers properly belonging to the other. That's a strict separation of powers, right? You don't see a lot of mixing of powers there, right? That's important, right? Madison and others are learning from that experience and saying, did that strict separation of powers necessarily work? Or did it actually lead to more powers because the legislator was so predominant in places like Pennsylvania and Vermont and others, right? So that is some of their lessons, right? So we saw Vermont, we see other places that do this. We see changes though too, because Massachusetts, for instance, in 1780, written by John Adams, starts to go a little bit away from this by giving the executive a limited veto power. We see that being influential on the founders. So we see Elbridge Gerry, we see James Madison, we see Morris. These are some of the founders who were thinking a lot about separation of powers, but they disagreed about the principle and how it should be embedded into the structure of the Constitution, right? This was a lot of their disagreement. As I said, Madison showed up with a plan. It was called the Virginia Plan. He presented that in May at the very beginning of the Constitutional Convention. It included things like the idea of a council of revision that would be composed of the president and a number of the national judiciary. In other words, the members would be on this council of revision who had the authority to examine any legislative acts, federal or state, and could veto them, right? So we think about why that, for instance, would have been a separation of powers issue, right? First off, the Supreme Court and the president are working together. That might be a problem. And they're giving authority on both the federal and state level to strike down acts of Congress together, right? So that was council revision was brought up again later on, right? But you could see why this might be a separation of powers issue. Congressional selection of the president. We talked about that a lot with Article 2 in the Electoral College, right? But there's a reason it keeps popping up, because one of the objections to the plan wasn't simply that, well, it'd be a bad idea because the people should have a voice. It was also because Albridge Gerry quite famously pointed out, this would make the president basically under Congress, right? He would be their pet. He would, they would have to fall and be dependent, right? That was the key word, that D word, dependency, right? They would be dependent on the goodwill of Congress. And that was a problem for separation of powers because it would inevitably make Congress more powerful, right, Jim? So hopefully the students understand that, but that was the objections to these kinds of plans was, well, wait, that's a separation of powers problem. We can't do that, right? And that's what
so it's all about separating the powers and balancing. So we want it to be that one can't control the other as well as they can't gang up on the other. So it's this constant struggle back and forth as they're building out this plan. And, you know, we have a lot of debates, not just the executive, we have debates over the judiciary as well. Can you kind of, and so again, guys, so that Article 1 is Congress, it sets up the legislative branch to make laws. Article 2 is the executive, the presidency. Article 3 is the judiciary, the courts. And how do they work separately? How do they work together? So they're trying to really spend this entire summer thinking of every scenario that could happen and figuring out how it would work and how would they keep it balanced at all times. So this is an intense thing that they're spending on, and really not just looking at whose job is what, but how are they measuring the system in itself. So very much like a big giant system at play as well.
Yeah, and I think the next slide should, if I recall, will mention how the judiciary comes into that. That's the appointments clause, right? And even how that got changed, where originally the plans were and how they got shifted in terms of these concerns about separation of powers. Yes, there we go. We see it here. Nathaniel Gorman of Massachusetts, who was the one who suggested the language about advice and consent of the Senate, right? James Wilson, who was a proponent of a very strong executive branch, wanted the president to have the sole ability to appoint judges. Gorman suggested this language of advice and consent. Historians argue about what that necessarily meant, if it was mostly about getting rid of corruption, for instance, ensuring essentially that the president didn't appoint cronies. It wasn't meant to be too strong of a check, but to ensure that there wasn't cronyism, because that was thought to be the most obvious problem. They thought if the Senate and the president work together, the reason it's an issue for separation of powers is it will create a cabal or an aristocratic branch where they will work together against the interests of the people. And therefore, we need to be careful about what that check is, about what the Senate can and can't do. So therefore, it's written to be a limited check and a limited sharing of power, so they don't work together too much, but they do enough to make sure that the president doesn't have too much power, right? So hopefully that makes sense to everybody, but that's kind of what's going on with something like the appointment of the judiciary.
So we've got this balance now across the branches and balance between the national government and the people. So we're balancing in all different ways. And it's ratified. There's the anti-federalists and federalists that are for and against it. There's debates around it, but it's very quickly tested. And I want to jump into some of the tests because we're running down to the last like 6 minutes, and I want to look at like the historic test on this and Maybury versus Madison, and then jump fast forward to a modern test. So I know the students really need to cover Maybury versus Madison because can you walk us through that case, Guys, if you don't know it, it's no big deal, but it's a good one to know. This is like the classic case that everybody should know around the Constitution, and it's still talking about the court. So Nick, jump us to Maybury versus Madison.
So we're talking Marbury. Sorry, Kerry.
Sorry.
Marbury versus Madison.
Marbury,
yes.
not Maybury. Marbury.
Mr.
That's
Marbury.
the town.
Yes, Mr. Marbury. The real issue here is we're talking about the concept we now call judicial review, and to some extent we're talking about judicial supremacy. And of course, we'll have a class on Article 3, and we can talk even more about what the courts do. But here we're talking about why it's a separation of powers issue, right? Marbury versus Madison gets into the election of 1800 that we've talked about. These midnight judges in February 1801 that John Adams and the Federalists lame duck Congress, because at that time you had lame duck Congresses and presidents that lasted for an extra 2 months in office because there wasn't a 20th Amendment to make January 20th inauguration day. So John Adams stuck around till March 4th. And in that extra time they had, he appointed John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and they passed these bills, the Judiciary Act, that created these new offices. And that was the so-called midnight judges, right? That they were making all these appointments to the judiciary before Jefferson and his allies could take office. And some of those commissions didn't get signed. John Marshall was still Secretary of State, which is an incredible thing to imagine. The Secretary of State not only became Chief Justice, but technically was working both jobs until the end of the administration, which will not ever be repeated, I would suspect. So he was a little busy and he didn't sign everything. And when James Madison, the new Secretary of State, showed up, the same James Madison, Jefferson told him, don't send any of the rest of the commissions. So this was a commission for the Justice of the Peace position in the District of Columbia. So Marbury sued for it under the Judiciary Act of 1789. The students don't need to know that much about the statute because that gets into the complicated stuff. The real important point here was that John Marshall took this as an opportunity to state exactly what the role of the Supreme Court was in this new constitutional system. And he thought the role was, as this quote suggests, it was emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law was. And Marshall said, look, we get the power of judicial review. We get to review for constitutionality of acts of Congress. And in this case, he was reviewing this Judiciary Act of 1789. They struck down a section of it, the section that Marbury sued under. Marshall's idea here was, look, Marbury's right. He has a right to the commission. He should have had it. But the Supreme Court can't give it to him because Congress should have never been able to give us the power. They didn't have the power to give it to us under the Constitution. Therefore, we can't give him what he wants, right? We call that a remedy in legal terms, but the point is Marshall was splitting the atom, right? He's saying, look, we have this power of judicial review to determine what's constitutional and what isn't. That's ultimately the job of the courts, and the Supreme Court in particular. And using this power means that Marbury's suit ends, right? And there are some political machinations and reasons for this, right? Because it meant that Jefferson won in the sense that these commissions didn't go out, but lost in the sense that he didn't believe Marshall was right about the role of the courts, right? This idea of judicial supremacy was the idea that the Supreme Court was the final arbiter or final force in determining the constitutionality of acts of government. Jefferson and other Jeffersonian Republicans strongly disliked this idea, right? They thought under checks and balances and separation of powers, every branch had an obligation to ensure what they did and what other branches did was constitutional. So we call this departmentalism. You don't need to really know the term so much as understand that Thomas Jefferson's point was, no, the Supreme Court isn't the sole actor here. The president has an obligation, Congress has an obligation because they represent the people. And so we have to make sure, all of us do, that anything that the federal government does is constitutional. And that takes us, at least briefly, we can mention Andrew Jackson and the battle over the bank, because I think it's worth talking about, because that's exactly what Andrew Jackson was saying. Yes, 2 minutes on the bank, and the great
and
Nicholas
then we are going to touch one of the Trump cases, because I gave the kids the option. Do they want to talk about
Trump
Andrew
versus
Jackson or Trump? Yeah, so they do want to hear a modern case. So maybe we
couple minutes on each. Yeah,
not even. We don't have that much time. 1 second on Jackson, and then let's do the Trump case at the end.
Well, just to sum up, is that Andrew Jackson followed that Jeffersonian tradition. So Andrew Jackson vetoed the national bank, right? This was the second national bank in 1832. He vetoed an act of Congress, and he issued a veto message. And he said, look, the national bank is unconstitutional. It's unauthorized. It's subversive to the rights of the states and the liberties of the people. And in particular, in that message, he gave that Jeffersonian interpretation. He said, I reject John Marshall's vision. And I think that the president and Congress, we all have an obligation to ensure that acts are constitutional. Therefore, the president gets an act of Congress and reads it and sees it as unconstitutional. It is his job, his duty, to strike it down as unconstitutional. So that was Jackson's argument, and it's a strong one as a historic example because it's so firmly grounded in constitutional arguments, right? It's a veto.
So we're seeing this push and pull. Yeah,
yes.
You're seeing this huge battle, and it's like fascinating. I keep thinking like WWF. And not that I watch
well,
like
for Jackson,
that
makes sense.
Right? Thank you. Maybe that's what it is. It's Jackson. Okay,
it's Jackson.
So we see these battles. We see that each branch is taking the Constitution and saying, it's my right, it's my job, it's my duty under the Constitution to define this branch and its role, and therefore defining with the other branch. So we're looking at how the court interprets the law, and we're looking at how what president sees as unconstitutional, it's your duty to represent and uphold and defend the Constitution. So fast forward, like 150 years? I can't do math right now.
More than that.
Yeah, more than 100.
That's almost 200 years. That's 188 years.
So let's look at a modern case, because the students asked for a modern case. So we'll end on this. So here's the big question in the case. How much power does Congress have to investigate the president's private financial history? So Nick, can you kind of give us a 2-second background and why this is kind of the job of Congress to look at the president's background? Because I always want to know, let's start there. Like, do they have a right to look into the president's background? And is it upholding and defending the Constitution in a way, just like Jackson would say? And how does it work out? And then tell us how the case rolled out.
Yeah, that's a good way of asking it, because we always remind ourselves on these discussions, right? We're talking about the constitutional issues, not the partisan or the political issues. And that means understanding this case along the idea of constitutional duty, right? Is, well, what is Congress's duty to check the powers of the presidency, right? Think about this like checks and balances in terms of the battles of the branches, right? That gets us away a little from 2020 and the particular political battles and shows us why this is actually an important constitutional question. So it really is, as Kerry suggests, about this subpoena power, and to what degree does Congress have both a duty and a right to investigate the president to make sure there's no corruption, there's no bad motives, that he or she is not acting in a way that subverts their duties to the Constitution, right? That's the actual question, right? That's really important. So it is about investigating the president's private finances, right? Which is generally speaking, is a private citizen, the president is protected, right? That they still get to be a private citizen. The concern is usually about what they do as president. So the question is how deep can they get to the relationship between the two? And the Supreme Court took this question this last summer. And in the majority opinion, they held that the lower courts did not take a, quote, adequate account of the significance of the separation of powers concerns in the case. So the Chief Justice saw that normally over the course of American history, these kinds of disputes between branches were resolved by the branches themselves, not the Supreme Court. And therefore, they were more political cases in some sense, right? What they're really looking for is what they call a valid legislative purpose, right? Is there a good reason, according to Congress's own powers and duties, to need this information, right? So as Kerry says, executive privilege doesn't apply in this case, but the court will not give unlimited congressional power. So their problem here is a narrow one, right? They're saying, look, there might be a good purpose, but we look for this history. What we see is usually the two branches resolve their disputes themselves. They don't go to the Supreme Court. And if they do, they need to be able to show a concrete legislative purpose, right? That goes to Congress's powers and duties themselves, and not just what you might call a more general search, right? I mean, I almost think of it as like Fourth Amendment terms, right? Is the difference. We talk about general warrants and then particularization, right? Is the generally speaking, you need to have some goal, right? Some stated object based on evidence that you're looking for. You can't just search for everything, right? So there's a particularization that the Supreme Court is asking for. So you would view this as kind of the Supreme Court standing in the middle. Courts should carefully assess this legislative purpose. So here, by the way, that's checks and balances. It's saying the Supreme Court is saying the courts have a job to actively peruse and ask whether or not this given legislative purpose is actually a good one, right, for viewing presidential records. And that courts should insist that subpoenas be no broader than is reasonably necessary. That actually gives a lot of power to the courts to decide what is and what isn't a valid legislative purpose. So we have to see that in terms of battles of the branches, right? That right there is checks and powers that the Supreme Court is actively putting in there, right, in order to say, hey, this is a duty of the courts and the lower courts to do, right? So I know we're running down on time, but yeah. I want to make sure that students understand this through everything we've been talking about today in terms of this language here, without getting too much into it. This is all about checks and balances.
So they're basically saying, Congress, if you have the right reason, you have the power to do it. President, even though you have executive privileges, it doesn't count. They can still check if they have the right reason. But I love that they throw themselves into it too. The courts say, and we're here to make sure it's the right ask for what they're looking for. So they said they can do it, but all those things have to be met. And you're right, they're saying, here's how the power is spread out over time, and you're not absolute, but you're on either case, on Congress or the president. You're not completely above the law, but you're not completely a blank book and do whatever you want as well. I love that they brought up the conversation around the Fourth Amendment, and we'll dive into that in a few months in the Fourth Amendment. We don't briefly, like general warrants.
They're also saying, look, if you can keep this out of court and you can figure this out between the two branches, figure it out between the two branches. Don't bring this to the Supreme Court. We don't want this. Again, we don't want to resolve your fight.
Yeah, it sounds like every teacher to every group of kids.
Yes, exactly.
Work it out amongst yourselves and be fair.
This is an outdoor fight during recess and saying, look, I hear you. Can we just work it out, please?
Yes, so I think this is awesome. Thank you so much for that look at a modern conversation that we're seeing today. And then we'll always do that when we see these cases come up. We can say, can they solve it themselves? And is it in their power and their duty to do these things? So a great way to think about separation of powers: whose power, whose duty, and how do they have to work together and balance each other? So thank you guys so much. Hope you had a great day in class, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, Nick. Have a good one.
All right, bye.
That was fun. I like that modern one.
Are we still recording? I think we're still live.
I'm going to stop that.